Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today we are speaking with Mr. Daniel McAdams about the planned increase of U.S. troops near Russia's border. Mr. McAdams is the executive director of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity and is the co-host of the Liberty Report with former Congressman Ron Paul. He served as the Foreign Affairs, Civil Liberties, and Defense Policy Advisor to Congressman Paul from 2001 to 2012. You can follow his work at ronpaulinstitute.org or on Twitter at Ron Paul Institute or at Daniel L. McAdams. You can find the Liberty Report at ronpaullibertyreport.com. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Russia-border. So Daniel, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. And this is, definitely a major announcement that just took place within the last couple weeks, and the mainstream press doesn't seem to be covering it perhaps the way they should, but I guess that's where alternative media comes in. So first of all, can you just give an overview of what the current U.S. troop levels and involvement look like in Eastern Europe, and then we'll go from there?
Well, I think in all of Europe, the U.S. has some 60,000 troops, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a significant force, and I hadn't really thought about it for a while, and I looked at the number again when we were researching a show that we did the other day on this, and I thought, wow, that is incredible. It's a whole sort of mini economy that we're subsidizing over there, not just in terms of underwriting their defense, but think of all the local economies that flourish, again at our expense, in places like Germany's enjoyed this sort of small boon for a number of decades, but only recently have places like Poland and Romania been hosting U.S. military facilities, not to mention the Baltics. So you can imagine if you have a small town, say in Latvia or Estonia, and all of a sudden a U.S. military facility comes with a lot of very well-paid people and all of the filtered down industry that's factored in, it's a huge boost to them. So I can see obviously why, aside from the rhetoric about the Russian threat, why they'd want to have this increased American presence there. It's good local money.
So what have the results been so far from the U.S. standpoint to having troops in Eastern Europe, and what have the consequences of all this been to the U.S. taxpayers, as well as Americans who are worried about blowback?
Well, the Obama administration announced that it was going to quadruple its spending on NATO activities in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe. So it's a huge economic outlay, and it will only increase. Not long ago, the Pentagon announced they're going to deploy, I think, 4,000 troops, a couple of hundred tanks, Bradley armored vehicles, howitzers, 1,700 pieces of other kinds of wheeled vehicles and trucks and things, all into Eastern Europe. So these are right up on the Russian border, almost literally right up on the Russian border. If you remember, there was a NATO exercise a few months ago where the U.S. troops were literally 3 football fields away from the Russian border. So this is really bringing it right up to the Russian border, and we'll probably talk about later, the justification is, quote, Russian aggression. So it's accepted without question by a lot of people. But if you stop and think about it, and put the shoe on the other foot, if the Russians were building up on the Mexican border, talking about American aggression within our own country, people would find it, I think, rather absurd.
No, I think they absolutely would. So let's get into some more details of these recent announcements, as well as the justification for it. It seems like people on Capitol Hill and in the media and politicians love saying that Russia is aggressing against Ukraine and elsewhere in Eastern Europe. But let's just start with what their justification is in this particular instance, along with what's involved with these announcements.
Well, this is what happens when wild claims become conventional wisdom, because now everyone just accepts the idea that Russia has been aggressive, and they accept a lot of the just factual problems with the claims around the Ukraine thing. The Americans were obviously involved. We did see Senator McCain up on the stage during the Maidan, encouraging them to overthrow their government. We did see Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State for Europe, super high-ranking American government official. We did see her on the street handing out cookies. We did hear her intercepted phone call where she said, Yats is the guy, meaning Yatsenyuk should be the prime minister. Lo and behold, he becomes the prime minister. All of these things did happen. They weren't our imagination. The idea that the U.S. Had no role at all in the overthrow is just so completely absurd. But unfortunately, the power of the propaganda inside the U.S. and the fact that our mainstream media walks in lockstep with the government, it has the opposite role that the media should have in a free society, which is to question and tend to look for facts to disprove what government claims. On the contrary, our mainstream media relies on bolstering what the government says and backing it up and drowning out any views that are contrary. But we do know there is a thing called reality. And in this place called reality, these things have happened. The U.S. did want to bring Ukraine into the Western orbit because they have been wanting to encircle Russia since the end of the Cold War. It doesn't take an expert in maps to look at the increase in NATO bases and in military facilities and how they have encircled Russia. This has been the strategy. The question is whether it's good or it's bad for the U.S. taxpayer and for our own security. So that is, in a nutshell, I think, what's happening. But what preceded it, all of these little sort of mistruths, one of them being, the Russians invaded Crimea and took it over. First of all, why should it matter to us what they did? This doesn't affect us whatsoever. If the Crimeans want to wave a Russian flag, a Mongolian flag, or a Chilean flag, who cares? The media won't report, however, that Crimea is about 90% ethnic Russian. So when there's a coup in Ukraine and the first thing they do is outlaw the use of Russian, then a place that has 90% Russian is going to get upset. So they had a vote and decided, no, we're going to get out. We're going to go back to Russia, where they had been for hundreds of years until the 1950s, where Russia had a military base. It didn't need to invade Crimea because it already had a base there. They'd been using the base. They'd had an agreement with Ukraine to use the base ever since the end of the Cold War. They had 20,000 troops there. They were already there. So, it's just lie after lie. And of course, anyone who points out that there are factual problems with what the media says, it's very easy just to say, oh, well, you're a Russian apologist. You're a Putin lover. Just like they said to people like Dr. Paul, oh, you just love Saddam Hussein. If you don't want to go to war with Iraq, we're going to make it a great place. But we do have to look at reality. We have to objectively look at reality, and we have to properly identify American interests. What are our interests in places like that little tiny rock called Crimea? The answer is none. Maybe we can trade with them. Maybe we'll take a vacation there.
Yeah, well, it seems like it's less about being pro-Putin or pro-Russia or anything like that, and it's just about being pro-facts. And whether we like the facts or not, the facts are the facts, and there's no way around that. But on the subject of trade, I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to get into Russia's trade relations with some of its neighbors and some of the countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Because hasn't Russia's customs union and their desire for stronger trade relations with former members of for members of the CIS that were previously part of the Soviet Union, hasn't that been a backdrop to this whole situation?
I think the emergence of sort of a rival pole has spooked the grand strategists in Washington, who think they know everything, who think the world is a chessboard. There is a customs union between Russia and several of the other CIS countries, Armenia and Belarus and the others, and it would have been Ukraine would have been able to join that. They were in the process of joining that, and when the coup happened. So. But there are certainly other multilateral organizations that Russia is heavily involved in. Think of something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which brings in a number of countries and may emerge as sort of a Eurasian rival to the so-called Western alliance. These things do arise. The irony, of course, is by isolating Russia and putting on trade sanctions and these sorts of things. If you didn't want Russia to form alternative blocs, well, you're having the opposite effect of what you wanted, because it will have that effect. Rivals will arise, and look, we're seeing the rise of trade in non-U.S. dollars, and that's a very significant thing as well. So we're pushing the things that we claim that we don't want to happen. So good job, guys.
Right. Yeah, and an end to dollar hegemony is starting to come about, and that's a factor in all this too, of course.
Yes.
But now I want to talk about, contrary to these claims of Russian aggression, one could make a claim that there is U.S. aggression, and to some extent we've already talked about that. But when you look at the troops there, the sanctions, the NATO exercises, the weapons and military defense systems the U.S. Has helped work out with some Eastern European countries, Poland especially. So what are your thoughts on whether we could classify what the U.S. is doing in Eastern Europe as aggression, and what is the status right now of the sanctions against Russia?
Well, I think anytime you put sanctions on a country, that's an act of aggression. I think Dr. Paul would say it really is an act of war, and it often leads to real war. But sanctions are always acts of aggression, and they're acts of aggression against the most innocent parties on both sides. Even if you hate the Russian government, why would you want to punish a Russian businessman, who may also hate his government, by the way, and telling him he can't do business in the West? You're hurting the very people who you shouldn't be hurting. And we saw how great sanctions work after half a century of sanctions against Cuba. They've done nothing but embolden a regime. So even if you want to harm the regime in Russia, it's a stupid way of going about doing it. It doesn't make any sense. But certainly housing troops on the border of another country that you're making wild claims about is an aggressive act. This week, the big news was that there was a U.S. Naval presence in the Baltics. Literally, a stone's throw away from St. Petersburg, essentially, and they were buzzed by a couple of Sukhois, of Russian fighter jets. And of course, the Navy went crazy. The U.S. government went crazy. The lapdog media went crazy. Oh, those horrible, aggressive Russians! Oh, they're coming to get us. Well, why are you, just a few hundred miles from their second capital and conducting military exercises? Is that not to be taken as being aggressive? It's only aggressive when they do it. It's not when we do it.
No, right. If there were Russian or Chinese troops stationed in the Gulf of Mexico or in Mexico or in Canada, you would have to expect that the U.S. would react accordingly.
Well, what happens when if President Trump starts building the wall, and the Mexicans say, we feel that the Americans are being aggressive, and they invite their new ally Russia in, or China. And this isn't as far-fetched, really, if you stop to think about it. They say, we feel really we're the victims of U.S. aggression under President Trump with this wall. We'd like to have a Chinese base in Tijuana. How would that go over in Washington?
Right, yeah. I mean, the question answers itself. Obviously, it wouldn't go over very well at all. But I want to return to the sanctions discussion a little bit. Do you see any changes coming in the sanctions? Do you think they'll be ratcheted up even further? Do you think there's a chance that we may see them removed? What's the status of the sanctions, and how do you see them changing moving forward?
Well, the problem with the sanctions is they always take on a life of their own because they never have the desired effect. It never produces the result. I don't think there's ever been an example. And some people would say, oh, South Africa is an example. But there are so many other factors. You just simply can't point to sanctions as being the one factor. There's just not a track record of them working in the way they're supposed to. But as we stand right now, supposedly, the economic sanctions against Russia are going to stay in force until at least 2018. After which case, who knows? I don't see anything really changing. I don't see the Russians backing down, whatever that even means, and I don't see the U.S. backing down. But what I do see happening and it's just a kernel of this. But what I see emerging in Central and Eastern Europe is a kind of an ambivalence. On the one hand, places like Hungary are treated, and Poland too, by the way, are treated very badly by Brussels. Brussels hates Poland's new right-wing government. I hate the word right-wing, but you know what I mean, conservative government. They've always hated Orban in Hungary, and they treat them very, very badly. First of all, with the whole refugee thing, they tell Hungary they have to take in a certain number of refugees, and Hungary does not want to do that. And after, of course, what we've seen on New Year's Eve in Germany, they're probably smart not wanting to. So they're treated badly on the one hand, and on the other hand, they have a potentially huge trade partner to the east in Russia, and they're told you can't do business with those guys. They're bad. You better not do business. And they've had to pass by deals like South Stream, which would have been very profitable for Hungary. And they have to pass up on trade. Hungary, I guess it was last year sometime, they contracted a deal with the Russians to help modernize a nuclear power plant in Paks, which is in south-central Hungary. And the Russians have done this before. They're experts in modernizing these kinds of nuclear power plants. I think they built Paks, actually. They helped build it. And so they contracted to help them modernize it. And a lot of tongue clacking in Brussels and Washington. How dare you do this? This is not right. Demanding that they cancel the deal. So I think you're seeing an increased amount of frustration in Central and Eastern Europe. And then certainly you've seen it all along among the business class in places like Germany. So maybe some cracks in the armor will come and will force, maybe Merkel will fall, as she should fall. But maybe something like this dramatic could happen. What about maybe a Brexit vote on June 23rd might change things? So I think there are a lot of factors that could cause things to change really quickly. In history, it seems like some of the most dramatic things just happen overnight. And they don't seem to. You wonder why it happened at that time. Why all of a sudden did people start chipping away at the wall? How did it happen? It just seemed to happen. So who knows? I think there are so many different factors that could change things dramatically in the next few months.
Well, and one factor that could change things, although I guess this is extremely unlikely, but I do want to ask you about it very quickly, would be some sort of color revolution in Russia or the end of the Putin administration. What attempts have there been to overthrow his administration in the past, and do you think there's any chance of that happening?
Well, I think there's always a chance happening because it's like the terrorists. They only have to get it right once, and you have to defend it against it innumerable times. Yes, the U.S. has tried numerous times to foment color-type revolutions. They spent millions of dollars propping up extraordinarily unpopular political parties in Russia. Interestingly enough, when they prop up a party in Russia, it's not the liberals or the leftists or anything. They prop up the most hard, right-wing, nationalist, extremist parties that you would think, gosh, the State Department, why would they like these kinds of guys? No, this is what just like in Ukraine, these are the kinds of parties that they prop up, but they're not popular. They don't get anyone's votes, and I think Russia also is on to them. Russia did something that the U.S. has done for a long time, which is that it forces organizations that are involved in politics that are funded from overseas to register as foreign agents. We have FARA, the Foreign Agent Registration Act here in the U.S., and the Russians have adopted a similar kind of law. And of course, the U.S. screamed bloody murder, how terrible they're cracking down on these wonderful NGOs. How can you do this? Well, these are subversive organizations, and they would be viewed the same way here in the U.S. If you remember back in the Clinton era, when there was some speculation about Chinese financing of the Democratic Party, it was a huge scandal among the right in the U.S. So how can we not expect that other countries wouldn't like their elections being tinkered with by a foreign power? It's what it means to be a country, to have sovereignty. So, but can they do it again? Excuse me. Yes, they can always do it again. They can always come up with plans. We have an enormous, out-of-control CIA that has nothing to do but think up crazy ways of messing the world up, and they've done a pretty good job of that so far.
Well, and another issue in terms of who is at the head of state in Russia, is that the second largest party in Russia is the Communist Party. So, like we've seen elsewhere in the world, whether it be in Iraq or in Libya, just because one leader goes down, if Putin were to be overthrown, that doesn't mean that the replacement is any better.
No, that's a great point, and that's a point that the U.S. will never make. They will never acknowledge the popularity of the Russian Communist Party. That is the opposition party. It's the only popular opposition party. And if you look in terms of votes and popularity, it's the only alternative to Putin's political structures. If he's overthrown, the communists would be in a position to take over. But the U.S. doesn't want anyone here in the U.S. to think about that because it undermines what they're trying to do over there.
All right, now I want to shift gears a little bit. In addition to the justifications that they put forth and the claims about Russian aggression, there are some maybe more real factors pushing this troop increase, one of which would be the military-industrial complex. So what role is the military-industrial complex playing in this recent announcement, and what are some of the other true motivations behind this troop increase near Russia's border?
I think you hit it on the head. I mean, there are a lot of weapons to be sold in Europe. The Americans want us to be the ones selling them. They don't want anyone else to. We ran a piece at the Institute a couple of days ago by one of my favorite writers. He's a former diplomat from India, and he wrote a great piece about how Kerry is coming over to India next week, I think it is. And not Kerry, I'm sorry. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter. And he's essentially going over there to represent big military contractors and telling the Indians what kind of weapons they should buy, So it's almost like some kind of carpet salesman going over there saying, you need 12 tanks and you need 5 of these. And, it's just so unseemly how much these people run Washington. They pay the think tanks, and the think tanks come up with very serious policy papers saying we need a more aggressive role in Europe, and it's just this. It's my great friend Chuck Spinney, who spent his career in the Pentagon as one of the good guys doing analysis. He calls it a self-licking ice cream cone, which is exactly what it is. But yes, they definitely will benefit. The neocons benefit from it because they continue in this self-delusion that we can run the world and remake it in our image. It's really their direct legacy from the philosophy of Trotsky, a permanent worldwide revolution. They continue in that. And then, there are so many other interest groups that benefit from it. Talk about evangelicals. There are a lot of people who are sort of brainwashed into thinking that we somehow can afford to spend more than $1 trillion every year running the rest of the world. It's a fantasy, and as Dr. Paul always says, it is coming to an end. It will come to an end. The only question is, how hard will the fall be when it finally comes?
Well, one unfortunate aspect of this whole situation is we still have several more months of this presidential election, and every single candidate, to some degree, is a saber rattling towards Russia. So I'm sure we'll hear a lot more of the neocon rhetoric over the next few months.
Yeah, there's no question about that. We put a piece up by Paul Craig Roberts today about Hillary and her horrible foreign policy. Good grief. She is just so bad. There's nowhere to turn. Even poor old Bernie Sanders, there was a video I saw the other day about all of his pro-war votes, and it's just, you can be discouraged if you only look to politics for the solution, But thankfully what you guys do and what we try to do is we look for education. It's a longer haul, and the satisfaction doesn't come as immediately, but at the end of the day, I think it's the only way we're going to make headway.
No, I think that's exactly right. So what do you think the fallout of this announcement will be, and what do you anticipate will happen in the near future?
You mean the troops in Europe, the increased NATO presence in Europe?
Right.
I think there has to be a Russian response. I think the Russians reacted when we talked about quadrupling spending and adding all these troops. They said we'll have an asymmetric response. So whatever that may be, maybe they'll. I mean, there's a number of moves they can make, and I'm not a military analyst per se, so they'll move this missile here or that missile there. They may do things like this. Who knows what they may do? They may work a lot harder on their alliance with China. It's always funny when you hear a State Department person say, "Well, most of the world is with us in our position on Syria." And I think it was, I don't know if you ever watched these, but if you ever watch the State Department briefings, there's a wonderful journalist from AP called Matt Lee, who is like one of the last people who's acting like a journalist, you know. And if you haven't seen this clip, I'll send it to you if you don't have it. It's worth everyone looking up, because here you have, I think it's John Kirby or one of these goofballs who was the State Department spokesman. He said, the entire world is with us on our position on Syria. And Matt Lee spoke up and said, "No, they're not. What are you talking about?" He said, except for Russia and China and India. Well, that's a big chunk of the world. That's a lot of people. So it's very funny, very, very funny.
Yeah, no, I'm familiar with Matt Lee, and I think you're definitely correct to be praising him in that way.
Isn't he fun to watch? He's fun to watch.
No, he definitely is, and we will put a link to that clip up at wakeupcallpodcast.com/Russia-border.
Great.
So everybody can take a look at that. So before we wrap up here, I want to ask you where you see U.S.-Russian relations headed. How would you describe the current state of relations between the two countries, and what do you anticipate will happen in the near future with that?
Well, it is hard to see a bright light. It really is. You think about under the next presidency. I mean, the president really only has legitimate power when it comes to foreign relations and foreign affairs. And the neocons are so ensconced in Washington. There's just no daylight between them and any candidate, probably even including Sanders. In a different way, his wars, his aggression would be for humanitarian reasons or something. But I try to look for some opening, and on a good day, let's put it this way, on a good day, Donald Trump will say something like, "Hey, I can get along with Putin, no big deal." Then you say, "Oh, maybe there's hope." And then the next day he'll say something completely stupid, and completely the opposite. So, is there any possibility, if does any candidate offer the possibility of improved relations? I would say Trump offers the possibility, but do I trust him for a second that he won't change his mind? No, unfortunately I don't. So what do we do? I mean, I hope we can try to stop this before we all go broke.
Yeah, no, let's hope so. And that seems to be one of the themes of the Trump campaign, at least in the last few months, where he'll say something that maybe has some truth to it and is definitely much different than what you usually hear from presidential candidates. And then everyone will complain, "Oh, he shouldn't have said that. It was so horrible." And then he'll issue 3 statements and he'll backtrack and he'll say something the next day.
Yeah, you're right.
So,
or he'll say something sensible like, we should not take sides in the Middle East. And then
right.
the next day he'll go to AIPAC and practically be on his knees, begging. So it's unseemly. So yeah, I wouldn't trust that for a minute.
No. Yeah, if we're relying on him to be the one person that might be slightly better on these issues, then we'll probably be disappointed in what comes if he becomes president.
Exactly.
So, all right. Well, on that note, let me ask you now. I read this off at the beginning of the show, but really quickly, can you just go over once again where everyone can follow your work?
Sure. It's the you heard of the Coctopus. This is the Paulopus, because Dr. Paul has his. Except we don't have any money. Coke has money. We don't. But Dr. Paul does. We do the daily Liberty Report together. That's every weekday. We do it live at noon Eastern time on the YouTube. It's also broadcast live in the Houston market on Phonoscope, our wonderful sponsors. So we do that daily at the Ron Paul Institute's website. We write a lot of stuff, myself and Adam Dick, who's our senior fellow. I do most of the foreign policy. He does the civil liberties, but we do a lot of writing, and we also just carefully curate other articles. We spend a lot of time finding the one or two articles that you need to read to understand the issue. So we don't. It's not like a shotgun where we have 8,000 articles to read. We take a lot of time to try to find the one best article on X, and so that's, I think, what we offer, and that's our comparative advantage. And also the fact that we write in plain language. We don't try to write like a bunch of PhDs. We write for average folks. We write in a way that we want to read ourselves. So we do that. And by the way, we are in the process of planning a conference in Washington on foreign policy. We don't have a date yet, but we sent out a few notices that, by the way, if anyone goes to our website, please sign up for our updates. I put out a weekly update where I'll write a little letter, and hopefully I'll write something a little funny and a little interesting, but and also give some announcements. And so we announced that we're interested in doing a conference in D.C. on non-interventionism. Anyone out there, if you want to help us and form a host committee, and we can finance it. And we had a huge response. So we're full speed ahead in having a conference in the heart of Washington sometime mid to late summer. June, July, early summer, I guess. So that will be, we're excited. That'll be our first real public conference. And then from there, we just keep moving ahead. Adam has a book coming out in a month or so. And we published Ron Paul's book last year. So we are chugging along, as small as we are and as careful as we are. We're chugging along, and we're waving the flag of non-interventionism and civil liberties.
Well, it's very exciting to hear about all the work that you guys are doing, and I was not aware that conference was being scheduled, but that too is very exciting to hear about. And I have to say I can't recommend ronpaulinstitute.org and the work that the Ron Paul Institute is doing. I can't recommend that highly enough. It's wonderful, and it is very easy to read and straight and to the point. So anyone who thinks they might be interested in checking that out, I highly encourage they do that. And of course, wakeupcallpodcast.com/Russia-border, which is the show notes page for this episode, will have links to ronpaulinstitute.org and to other resources that we've discussed over the course of this interview, and other resources related to the Ron Paul Institute and the Liberty Report. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/Russia-border is the place to go for anyone who's interested in learning more about this and about what the Institute has going on. And on that note, Daniel, I want to thank you very much for joining me today and discussing such an important yet sadly neglected topic, this announcement of the U.S. troop increase near Russia's border. So thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thanks very much. You guys do great work, and I always enjoy coming on talking to you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes, or subscribe on Stitcher, and check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.